Leadership is hard to define. Lord, let us be the ones to define it with justice. Leadership is like a handful of water. Lord, let us be the people to share with those who thirst. Leadership is not about watching and correcting. Lord, let us remember it is about listening and connecting. Leadership is not about telling people what to do. Lord, let us first find out what people want. Leadership is less about the love of power and more about the power of love. Lord, as we continue to undertake the role of leader, let us be affirmed by the servant leadership we witness in your Son Jesus. Let us walk in the path he has set, and let those who will follow. Let our greatest passion be compassion, our greatest strength love, our greatest victory the reward of peace. In leading, let us never fail to follow. In loving, let us never fail. Amen. Servant leadership is a big topic. We can't possibly cover it all in just a half an hour or so. So we will focus on two areas of servant leadership. First, the principles of servant leadership. In other words, what are the foundations or the underpinnings of the concept? And secondly, how Jesus applied servant leadership to become the most effective leader of all time. Our goal is to create a foundation for possible future study on your part. It's something that if you would like to learn more about, we can recommend books that we will at the end of this presentation for you to do personal study. Next, we want to examine why servant leadership has become such a timely topic at this point in time. First of all, our new Pope, Pope Francis, brings a new perspective to the church. There's a probability of meaningful change, and the change will no doubt bring us back to basics, namely, love God and love thy neighbor. We face certain realities in our church today. First of all, parish life is far more dynamic than ever before. Therefore, we have a need for more Catholics to step up and assume more active leadership roles at all levels. In addition, we face many new challenges that are different than ever before. We will review some of these as a foundation for understanding why we need to have servant leadership at this point in time. Let's review some of the new challenges that are facing our church today. First, secular influences are eroding spiritual values, especially in our youth. What with the nature of movies, TV, music, clothing, the way young people emulate celebrities, the use of the internet, the incredible growth in social networking, all of these are influencing and eroding spiritual values. Secondly, we have more multicultural parishes today than ever before. In fact, multicultural parishes are now the norm. This introduces new cultural and language issues that we never had before. There's a need in some parishes to run concurrent programs. What we used to refer to as minorities within our parishes are now in the majority, and we have to learn to adjust to this new environment. A third new challenge is the changes going on in our traditional family structure. Today, 70% of all families are now dual income, up 30% in the past 10 years. The traditional model of families in the past, with father working and mother at home, represents only 7% of all families. As a result, faith formation in the families are diminished due to working, lifestyle, and preoccupation with other activities. The fourth new challenge is the deterioration of marriage. 35% of all families now are single parent. 40% of all births are to unwed parents. And 40 to 50% of all marriages will end in divorce. As a result, the sacrament of marriage has undergone significant change in the past few decades. Pope Francis, in a closing speech to the bishops at the recent synod, gave a beautiful testimony for the need of servant leadership in the church. He stated, and I quote, "So, the church is Christ. She is his bride, and all the bishops, in communion with the successor of Peter, have the task and the duty of guarding her and serving her, not as masters, but as servants. The Pope, in this context, is not the supreme Lord, but rather the supreme servant, the servant of the servants of God." End of quote. So if the Pope can look at his role as the supreme servant, or the servant of the servants of God, which embrace all of us, we certainly can see the need to embrace servant leadership. The bottom line is that all of us must learn how to become more effective leaders. We must use the principles that Jesus created in becoming the most effective leader of all time in helping him build his church. Let's now take a look at two terms, leadership and management. Sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, but they are in fact different. By definition, management is the process of planning, organizing, implementing, coordinating, and controlling activities, whereas leadership is the ability or an innate quality to motivate and inspire others to achieve a goal. The bottom line is that leadership is a quality and management is a process. Whereas leadership, on the other hand, is that ability that a person has to be able to motivate and inspire others. Ideally, you would like a manager to be an effective leader and a leader to be an effective manager, but they are two different qualities, two different capabilities. So now let's move forward. Perhaps the best way to explain the difference between leaders and managers is by saying that leaders have people follow them and managers have people work for them. Leaders have people follow, managers have people work for them. Management and leadership are two different skill sets. Management is a learnable process. You can learn the principles of management to plan, organize, delegate, control, follow up. Leadership, on the other hand, is either an instinctive, natural capability or a trait that one adopts by emulating other successful leaders. In other words, you can teach and learn management technique and process. Leadership, on the other hand, comes to you either instinctively or naturally, or you can emulate the traits, the characteristics of other successful leaders and attempt to become a more effective leader in that way. Now, let's take a look at what makes effective managers. First, they're able to plan and organize. They're able to get things done through other people. Next, they're able to execute a vision. They might not be able to create the vision, but they're able to break down a strategic vision into its components. They're able to direct day-to-day efforts. They can plan, organize resources, anticipate needs. They're comfortable with details. They like to have work rules, processes, standards, and operating procedures and manuals. They're good at getting things done on time and within budget. Now let's take a look at the attributes of effective leaders. First, they have high levels of honesty and integrity. This is crucial in getting people to believe and buy into the vision and goals. Next, they have vision. The ability to know where you are, where you want to go, and how you will get there. They can see into the future. Next, effective leaders have superior judgment. They're able to make the right decisions. Next, they have ability to inspire, whether an individual or a team, and ensure that each person knows their role. Next, they're uncomfortable with the status quo. They have a need or a compulsion to do things differently and courage to think outside the box. They have superior communications and people skills. They're able to keep people informed and motivated. Now that you have a better understanding about the difference between management and leadership, let's get into servant leadership and ask the question, what is servant leadership? Well, in the essence, servant leadership is a philosophy or style of leadership. In a classical sense, there are four main types or styles of leadership. The first is what we call the autocratic style, or the do as I say style of leadership. An example of this would be the old football coach Vince Lombardi of the Green Bay Packers. He ran a very disciplined organization, and all of the players did exactly what he told them to do in the manner in which he told them to do it. There was no room for individual judgment. He was autocratic, almost dictatorial. The next type or style of leadership is democratic style, or do as I do. A great example of this in contemporary times is Mother Teresa, who saw herself as the consummate servant of God. A third type or style of leadership is laissez-faire. It's a French term which means leave alone. So this style is do as you like. In effect, this leader abdicates in many respects responsibility and authority by surrounding him or herself with people, high quality people who they can trust to do the job. A political example in recent times was President Ronald Reagan, who surrounded himself with very good people who had skills that he did not possess, and then he allowed them to do their job. The fourth type of or style of leadership is servant leadership. This is the type of leadership that assumes the role, I will do it. And the best example of this servant leadership style is Jesus Christ. What you need to take away from this description of leadership styles is that servant leadership is simply a different style. It's not new. On the other hand, it's not used very much. It turns a traditional organizational pyramid upside down. Let's look at the leadership pyramid for a second. On the left, we have the traditional top to bottom organization, in which the leader is at the top, various levels of organization underneath them, down to the bottom where all of the followers are of that particular leader. This is the traditional view of leadership. To the right is the servant leadership view of an organization, in which the leader is at the bottom, serving the needs of the layers of the organization above them, and ultimately all of the followers. So in essence, servant leadership literally turns the organizational pyramid upside down. Now let's take a look at how the term servant leadership came about. It wasn't until 1970 that a social psychologist named Robert K. Greenleaf wrote an essay entitled "The Servant as Leader." It was a result of studying leadership techniques from the past as well as from the current, and trying to determine what this leadership style was that he had identified and called servant leadership, or the servant as leader. Basically what he did was he studied the methods that were used by Jesus Christ, as well as other leaders from the past, as well as many from the future. And he identified 10 common characteristics that comprised what we call servant leadership. Now let's take a look at each of these characteristics. There are 10 characteristics of servant leaders. Number 1, they listen. They use active listening. Number 2, they're empathetic. They're able to get into the shoes or on the other side of the desk of the other person. Number 3, they're compassionate. They have a healing attitude. Number 4, they have a high sense of awareness. They know what's happening around them. Number 5, they're persuasive. They're able to convince rather than coerce compliance. Number 6, they're able to conceptualize, to envision a desirable outcome. Number 7, they have foresight. They're able to look into the future. Number 8, they have stewardship. In other words, they assume ownership, responsibility for what they do. Number 9, they're able to cultivate followers. They're able to develop people. And number 10, they're able to build community, teamwork, morale, esprit de corps. They're a good coach. Let's now take a look at the biblical foundation for servant leadership. Jesus announces the need for servant leadership in Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28, when he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." He continues, "And whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many." So Jesus put it right out there in the Bible for us and said, this is the way we need to serve others. Let's look at the greatest act of servitude, perhaps in the history of man. It establishes a foundation for Jesus to explain the need for servant leadership to his apostles and for all of us. The first and perhaps greatest act of servant leadership occurred at the Last Supper when Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. In John 13, verses 3 to 15, I quote, Jesus got up from the meal and wrapped a towel around his waist and poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel. When he had finished, he asked, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." This was a remarkable act of servitude that we want to elaborate on so that you get a true understanding of the significance of why it is considered the greatest act of servitude ever. Let me give you some background on the symbolism of washing feet. Back in the time of Jesus, the washing of feet was a common practice when entering a home. People back then walked from village to village. The roads were not improved. They wore sandals. The roads were dusty. Their feet and their clothing picked up the dirt. So when they walked into somebody's home, it was proper that they would wash their feet. It was a task that was reserved for a servant or the lowest ranking member, perhaps the youngest family member, to assist the guest in washing their feet. The apostles, when they saw this act being very familiar with the nature of the servitude that was implied, were probably stunned, absolutely stunned, by this humble act of washing their feet. Jesus did this to set an example by voluntarily assuming the role of the servant by an act that they truly understood. Jesus was demonstrating the role of a servant leader for all of us to follow. Leadership is a universal need or role. Just about everyone in every position and walk of life has a leadership role, whether it's a mother, father, guardian, executive, manager, supervisor, ministry head, neighborhood or community leader. We all are called upon at one time or another to lead. So the principles that we're talking about in terms of using servant leadership are really applicable to all of us, not just those in higher level positions. We can all learn how to lead more effectively. We already know the question, what would Jesus do? WWJD. You see that on bracelets. Now ask, how did Jesus do it? HDJDI. Let's study how Jesus did it. How can we learn the Jesus way of leading? We can learn this way by understanding the things that he did to apply servant leadership. We've identified 10 specific ways, practices, or techniques that he used in applying servant leadership, and would like to illustrate each one. And would like to make this an interactive learning process. I will state a practice or a technique that he used, and ultimately will provide an example of that from the Bible, I'd like you, when I ask the question, to think about it for a second and jot down an event or situation from the Bible that you think illustrates the practice or the technique that he used. For instance, if we were just doing a practice exercise, I would say, what was the first miracle that Jesus performed in his public ministry? Of course, the answer is the wedding feast at Cana, where he turned water into wine. That would be an example of a question, and that would be a way for you to respond. So, let's get into the process. The first practice that Jesus used was the way in which he valued diversity. He sought out other points of view. He accepted new and contrary opinions from those around him. What would be an example from the Bible? Just take a second and jot it down. One example is he surrounded himself with a very diverse group of apostles: fishermen, tax collectors, carpenters, soldiers, tradesmen. He valued diversity on his team. The second method that Jesus used in implementing servant leadership was that he created a culture of trust. He was able to delegate responsibility and authority. He believed that everyone would fulfill their roles once they understood how to do something and what to do. Give me an example from the Bible that illustrates building a culture of trust. One example is that Jesus entrusted the apostles with the overwhelming task of establishing the church and spreading Christianity. After Jesus was crucified, the total responsibility rested upon the shoulders of the apostles. The third method that illustrates servant leader principles was how Jesus developed leaders. He led by example. He let his apostles fail. Can you think of an example from the Bible where he developed leaders? One example is that he carefully nurtured Peter to become the rock upon which he built his church. He patiently guided the other apostles to change from a frightened band into consummate evangelists. These are two good examples from the Bible about how Jesus developed leaders. Example number 4 is how Jesus had an intense desire to help people. He showed great compassion and love wherever he went. Can you think of an example from the Bible? How about the woman being stoned? Or all of the miracles that he performed, like curing the blind man and the lepers, raising Lazarus, the loaves and fishes. All of the all of the miracles are good examples of how he showed an intense desire to help people. The fifth example is how Jesus provided encouragement and support. He created within his followers a can-do attitude. He encouraged the apostles to go outside their comfort zone. Can you think of an example from the Bible? One great example is when he asked Peter to walk on water. Peter had to have great encouragement and support to do that. Or the post-resurrection appearances, when he appeared to the apostles, provided them with the gift of the Holy Spirit so that they could turn from the frightened band of men that they were into consummate evangelists. He provided encouragement and support. The sixth method that Jesus used to illustrate servant leadership was that he sold rather than told people what to do. He made them want to do it. He convinced rather than commanded. Can you think of an example from the Bible? How about the Sermon on the Mount, in which he proclaimed to all the fundamental principles of Catholicism? Or the use of parables. What a remarkable thing he did by using parables. Consider the fact that the audience that he spoke to were not learned people by and large. They were just average run-of-the-mill villagers and people who came to hear him speak. He knew that he could not use deep theological principles and techniques, so he developed the practice of teaching a principle by the use of a parable in language and examples that they would understand. So he was able to continue to sell them on concepts rather than simply telling them. The seventh practice was how Jesus focused on others first. It was always you, not me. He was always the servant, not the master. It was always all about the other person. Can you think of an example from the Bible? The ultimate, the passion and death of Jesus, in which he was only thinking about us, not himself. And followed by the resurrection, because he knew that his death would not be fulfilled until he rose again from the death and allowed us to open the gates of heaven for all eternity. The eighth method was how Jesus planned for the long term. He anticipated future needs. Can you think of an example from the Bible? Here are some. The creation of the role of Peter, the first pope. He knew that after he was gone, he had to have somebody in charge of the church. So he carefully nurtured Peter to assume that role. Then, through divine intervention, he provided us with the Gospels in the New Testament of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, knowing that we would not be able to remember his words forever without them being captured in a form that would allow us to use them from time immemorial. And finally, the enduring role of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit would be there for us now and forever. The ninth practice that Jesus used was being humble, his incredible sense of humility. He had no titles or wealth or signs of power. He just instinctively assumed the role of servant. Can you give an example from the Bible that illustrates his humility? How about the birth of Jesus in a stable? Here the Lord and Master of the universe allowed himself to be born in such humble surroundings. Or the temptation by the devil on the mountain, in which the devil offered him all of the wealth, all of the things of the world and whatnot, and Jesus rebuked him. Or the inquisition by Pontius Pilate, when Pontius Pilate said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Instead of Jesus responding, "By all means," he simply said, "Thou sayest it." Examples of the humility of Jesus. The 10th and final method that Jesus used in implementing servant leadership was the fact that he was totally and completely mission focused. He maintained a perspective of the reason why he came to earth throughout his ministry, throughout his life. He stayed on task. Can you think of an example of his focus on mission in the Bible? The event, the crucifixion, the sole purpose for him becoming man, coming to earth, was to experience the death and resurrection that would allow us to achieve eternal salvation. It's the event. Let me conclude the presentation with an idea that you can take home with you. Basically, it's this. The major principle behind servant leadership is to think first of the needs of the other person and not yourself. Then act like Jesus did and serve the needs of those people. The best test of a servant leader is, first, are those served growing as human beings? Second, are the goals of the organization being accomplished by this servant leadership technique? Are those being served more likely themselves to become servant leaders? If you can answer yes to all three of these questions, you're well on your way to become a servant leader.